of this situation. And that's right, they ought to. That's the situation that lends itself to them. Well, here's what the world might do if they think the United States is becoming less and less secure as a borrower. They will do what lenders always do. What do they do if they think you're not a good risk? Answer: they either don't lend to you, or they lend to you and demand higher interest to compensate them for what they perceive is the higher risk of lending to you. So the rest of the world will say, okay, we'll lend to you, Mr. Obama. We'll give you the $800 billion you want to spend. We understand the point of it. We're even in agreement, because it helps us too to keep you afloat. But we're not doing it the way we used to, because you're presenting us with risks. So you got to pay us a higher interest rate. Wow, if the United States has to pay higher interest, if interest rates go up, we have a whole new set of problems. A rising interest rate means, generally, that the cost of buying things on credit goes up for everybody. Every business will now have a higher interest rate. Every individual who buys a house or a car on time will have higher payments. This is not good for the car industry, which barely surviving as it is. Less people will buy cars, less people will buy homes. The price of homes will go down if less people buy homes because the interest rate is too high. The price of housing is already collapsing, and that's very bad for the... You get the picture? This is a very thorny question. And one sign of how serious this crisis is that we are so desperate to do something, like the stimulus plan, that we don't want to ask these questions. They're put aside. They're bracketed. We're not to worry. Either because there's no problem there, that's crap, but a lot of people will say that because they're afraid. Or the more honest answer, which you will get in Washington, is if we don't solve this problem now, all these other conversations will be academic, in the worst sense of the term academic. So it's kind of, yeah, maybe, but what choice have we got? We have to. And there's a lot of support for that position on both sides. Whatever they say publicly, they understand this kind of issue. But you should be aware that if the government borrows, it may have to pay higher interest rate with all those problems. If the government borrows, that's going to have to be paid back, and that's a problem. And we're even not done. Here's the third problem with the government borrowing. When the government borrows and soaks up all the money that can be lent, then there isn't any money lent to the private sector. It means businesses. It's called in economics crowding out. The government is crowding out the private borrower because it's literally soaking up all the lendable money. It's desperate, it has to do it, but it creates difficulties. Serious difficulties, because other companies that might have been able to get the money to keep going won't be able to. Or on much less attractive terms. They'll have to give it back sooner. They'll have to pay more points. They'll have to pay a higher interest rate. They'll have to give over more control to the lender than they would like for their bid. All those kinds of pressures begin to build up because nobody who's a lender wants to lend to the private because it's risky. You prefer to lend to the government, which promises you that they will guarantee to pay back. And the government is a more reliable borrower than the private. So between the government soaking it up and the government being the preferred lender anyway, the preferred borrower, businesses who are already complaining that credit is tight may be complaining much more loudly. And again, the answer to them is, yes, that's true, it's a problem. But if we don't do this, the game is up. It's all for you signs of how very, very serious this crisis is, beyond anything that is still being admitted most of the time. Yeah.
It might sound like a stupid question, but if the United States doesn't have any big money reserves anywhere, it's going to have to borrow all the $800 billion.
Or print it. Now, of course, the government could take. I don't want to do this yet because partly it'll scare you. But there, of course, is always an alternative. In every country that reaches this crisis point, there is, of course, an alternative. And the rest of the world may force this on us. The rest of the world will say, I'm not lending you anything. But I'll tell you what I'll do to the government. I will give you money to spend, but you got to give me something that I want. And another debt from you, I don't want. Well, what do you want, Mr. Obama would say. And the answer, now don't laugh, I'll take Oklahoma. Careful, this happens all the time. We will give them property. We will give them property. If they will give us the money to allow the government to do what it has to do to get out, and what we have to do is start giving them the wealth of the United States, they will. That's what other countries do. Yeah.
We have military bases all over the world that could be sold.
Absolutely. Could sell military bases. The United States companies own facilities all around the world. We could sell those. The government might do a survey and go to a company and say, we're very sorry, General Motors, you have a lovely factory here in northern Germany. You've had it for 50 years. It's called the Opel Company. It's very nice. You have 12 days to sell it. Good luck. Find somebody. That's it. That's it. And then we'll work out something with you. You'll get paid, but you'll immediately lend it to the government, this money, and blah, blah, blah. Well, if you're at the end, if you have a basic crisis and you don't have the wherewithal to solve it without these measures, you have to start thinking of measures. What you're watching here is the slow, steady erosion of the position of the United States that it has held for much of the last 100 years. That is being undermined. It is still a very strong position. Don't misunderstand. The United States position is still very wealthy, still very strong. But it's not what it was, and that process is what all these deals, this changing, this is not complicated. If Brazil is showing more and more difficulty and shrinkage of its interconnections with the United States, while there's an expansion of its interconnections and dependence with China, you don't need an advanced degree. They're going to change their politics, and they'll change their global position, and change where they think they ought to spend their money, and change who they ought to support in the UN, etc., because it's a question of their survival. The United States' position keeps shrinking. The United States' political position is much weaker than it was. Its economic position is much weaker. The one thing that the United States still has unquestionable dominance in is the scariest thing of all, which is its military. And in the history of the human race, if you're losing your political, ideological, and economic muscle and influence, and you have something that still is dominant in the world, the temptation to make what you have reaffirm what you're losing is not small. And you can see across America the people who think like that. The people in the Bush administration, there were a lot of those who thought like that. There are fewer of those who think like that in Obama, but they're there too. And that's a part of American politics, as it would be in any other society. But it's a danger I don't want you to distract you from, but it's not quite what the course is about. And none of you should be under any illusion, no matter how smooth the president of this or that country is, including our own, and how confident, projecting that image, that's very nice, but that's not the reality. That's the persona, it's not the reality. Not here, nowhere else either. If you put all the levels of government together, if you put the federal, state, and local, it's by far the biggest employer. No private employer comes anywhere near that. So in terms of just the sheer magnitude of the number of people whose personal income depends on a check from some level of government, that's bigger than any particular private industry. By a large, it's not even close. On the other hand, the majority of people are employed in the private sector in the United States. If you add up all the private employees and put against them the government is much smaller total than the total private sector. It's more of a private economy than a government economy in our society. And that's been true pretty long. The role of the government has gotten larger pretty steadily for 50, 60 years, but it is still a minority of the total employing class. The business about small employees, small companies, and big companies, that's a bit of a charade. This economy is dominated by large corporations. But the way the large corporations dominate is not only by employing people. So, for example, General Motors dominates an enormous swath of industry. But much of that industry is organized as little companies who produce, a carburetor ring or a plastic strap that holds your some piece of equipment in your car seat to the underside of the seat. And there are historical reasons and tax reasons why it's more profitable to have this piece of stuff made in a little company with 11 people outside of Detroit rather than in the River Rouge plant or a big company. But the idea that this is a little business which is somehow independent, that's silly. That's just silly. That is, a huge portion of these small companies are completely dependent on one or two or three large companies for whom they are feeder suppliers. And it's really a detail of law and accounting that they're kept independent. And you can actually see it. When the law changes, they're swallowed up again and become the divisions of the big one. When the law shifts, they are separated out again. But that's an arrangement that the people who actually are in these industries understand very well. They're not independent. So it's a little bit of a misleading number to count that way. 500 corporations do 2/3 of the business in the United States. That's what you need to understand. This is not about economics. This is theater. Just theater. And that's why they have all those advisors who make sure they're dressed in a certain way and made up in a certain way and have the lighting in a certain way and have the flag over here and a small dog over there, all that. Okay. Let's go back. When the government is in trouble, as it is now, and I'm thinking particularly of the state and local governments, stay with me as you understand now the feedback. If the state governments cut back, which they're doing everywhere, City of New York is going to cut back, the state of New York is going to cut back, California just announced $1 billion worth of cutbacks. So what are we going to have? We're going to have less spending by the state government on buying objects and hiring people. And of course, with the fewer objects that they buy, some company is going to have fewer customers because the government's cutting back. And people are going to get laid off or moved from full-time to part-time. And they're going to have less money, and they're going to spend less money, which is less tax. In other words, the government's reaction to the economic downturn in the case of state and local governments always makes the downturn worse. One of the reasons Obama's plan that was passed last week has in it, I don't remember the numbers, between $200 and $300 billion, if I recall, aid to cities and states, is he's trying, which makes sense, to offset this impact that the states and cities, they all know, is going to have. But be aware, if one state alone, California, has $41 billion trouble in 1 year, and remember the 800